welcome everybody back to Simply Human, and we're really excited. This is the third video in a series that we are doing a deep dive in imposter syndrome. And so today what we are focusing on is cultivating curiosity, humility, and humor as the part of the path to developing resilience and transcending just the coping strategies to get by the immediate discomfort of imposter syndrome. Let me just say today, I know this is down in the comments, but I'm a clinical psychologist. Karen is a leadership and self-trust coach and also an executive coach. Our goal is to give you the insight that, oh, wow, like I think I'm dealing with this, and to start to understand like different ways that you can approach it. Does that sound good for you, Karen?
Yeah, and also we've also based it on a lot of my, just to recap a little bit, because I have imposter syndrome, still on the journey of ridding it, because every once in a while it still creeps up, but it's not as heavy in my life as it used to be. And so I think this is what's exciting too, because it's not just us doing it from what we heard or whatever, but I personally have experienced, and Christine and I have been talking about this subject for a while, that we decided, oh, let's do this on a podcast, as well as all these other topics that we've been talking about, that really, again, helps us deal with living in this earth, dealing with the interactions we have as humans, and then getting to know ourselves even better than we had in the past.
Yeah. So today, when we sort of share with the folks about why we believe that curiosity, humility, and humor are such important parts in the journey to overcoming imposter syndrome.
I think in the end, for me, when I started to make it a habit and begin to shift that with understanding life is more about coming as a beginners, like when you're a child. And that to me gives me the framework to understand curiosity. And I work with executives too, is I'm realizing the more you go in with curiosity, then you don't evaluate right away. It allows me to stop my problem solving mind that I'm used to doing, because I'm a human being and we love to problem solve, right? We're just, what do you call it? Like our brain is wired for that, is what you would, wired for that. And so it allowed me to really practice curiosity going into situations differently. And I don't make the assumptions. I don't go automatically to different things, because I become more curious in communications, or just when I see something or my reactions, I just try to practice curiosity, which helps me. Humility is about self. So we can talk about that. And then humor is just a way now that I can deal with it. I am who I am. And so we'll be talking more about that. So these to me are really key tools. That's what I love about what we're doing. They're like, if you look at radio dials on not a radio dial anymore, but like this, and you have those different like balance, fade, all this other stuff. It's kind of like curiosity's one, humility's one, humor is one, and we'll deal with something about mistakes and growth as another dial. It's like all these dials are things that you can move to help you overcome imposter syndrome.
I'm a visual processor, so I really appreciate that metaphor. That's so perfect, because although we're going over a bunch of different strategies, you do evaluate in the context. I was just thinking about this morning. In a prior episode, we talked about some of the underlying causes of imposter syndrome, and one of them being masking. And you see this particularly in the neurodivergent community. I was thinking, like, we're not saying that if you mask, you're going to suffer from imposter syndrome, because sometimes you might need to in this social situation to be effective. It's really about being mindful and thoughtful and intentional by evaluating what feels true to you and how can you be the most effective, and to use it judiciously. The problem more arises when it becomes an automatic habit. No matter what situation there's a mask there. That is most likely then going to contribute to a long-term fear of being found out and being discovered. And those are the emotional fears of imposter syndrome.
Yes. And I think that's where we want to differentiate, because it's used for any time someone's just masking just for the moment or something. And I got to tell you, I knew I had imposter syndrome when it became what you just said, where it was like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I just lived in with just overwhelming, always overwhelmed, not feeling really my space. But I was very good at disguising. I'm a functional imposter syndrome person, because nobody from work knew that. until I started telling me, like, really? Like, even from MIT, when I went to MIT, I felt like I was a fraud afterwards, after I graduated. I shouldn't have been there. And I think that's what we want to say is, it's easy to say that you have imposter syndrome, but when you really have it, that's what I think has to describe it, where it like really becomes you detrimental to your life.
Well, yeah, this actually leads really perfectly into the first thing that we're going to talk about is recognizing the inner critic and how to use humility as the way to overcome the inner critic. I know imposter syndrome is often spoken about for like high performing professionals or highly educated people who feel that they don't belong. But we've talked about how, gosh, you can feel it with a group of friends. You can be hanging out with your friends and you might be like me. I have Asperger's or autistic spectrum, and I can be kind of awkward. I didn't learn masking, so I'm just awkward. But the people who are maybe have used masking have learned a strategy to fit in, be safe. And so you may have a critic going on in there saying, oh, you shouldn't have said that. That wasn't funny. Did you see that? Nobody laughed at that joke. Like, oh my gosh, they're going to discover that you're really not this cool person that you think you are. That's, the inner critic that's constantly threatening you that your strategy of masking, I'm going to use masking interchangeably somewhat with imposter syndrome because it is the masking that contributes to feeling imposter syndrome in these more general ways. And that inner critic is just always there, like, oh, you shouldn't have said that. Did you see that? Did you see those looks? I mean, it's constantly criticize. You were too loud. You were too pushy. You need to be quiet. Oh, you sounded stupid right there. Right? That the critic is constantly in you when you're just trying to show up and be accepted. Right? Does that resonate? Do you know what
Yeah. And I think the thing that helped me was when someone said, that inner critic then is something that we are wired to have to protect us. Everybody has an inner critic because it is when what you call it, either the surviving brain, I forgot what we call it, the lizard brain, whatever, the caveman brain, whatever you want to call it, is what we're wired to create us from danger. So the inner critic has its role in helping us become better. It's when it overcomes, when it goes, we just accept it as fact. That's what hurts us, the inner critic. That's what I remember. It's like we're pre-wired for that. So it's not like, and it's maintaining the distance from the inner critic that you can say, thank you for telling me the information. Goodbye. But the one thing I want to tell you that I thought was funny was, I don't know if this happened to you guys, but I remember how I remember the inner critic. The story that I have is, it was in a work setting, and this person was talking to someone else, and I swear I caught her eye, and she didn't even nod or anything. And I said, oh, what did I do wrong? Actually, it was an executive or something. I'm like, she didn't even acknowledge me. Oh my God, I must have done something wrong. And just imagined it, right? Because that's the inner critic. But in actuality, it was just because she was talking to someone and just did not catch my eye. I thought she caught my eye, but she did it because, the way I was angled or whatever. But to me, it's just kind of interesting how the stories that are made up that we learn about. That's why it's so important about the curiosity and the humility part. So anyway, so that's one of the stories I want to talk about, where our inner critic is trying to save us from embarrassment. And so
yeah, this is what we're calling starting to tune in and recognize the inner critic stories, because it comes in a story. I work with a lot of men in my practice, and a lot of times when I'm dealing with men, is their inner critic is, you're not enough. It's probably you're not enough, you're failure, inadequacy, and then shutdown happens. And these stories, they don't just come out of nowhere. A lot of times they'll come from our childhood. We might have grown up with critical parents, and then we internalize that voice, right? Because our parents were trying to keep us safe by wanting us to do better, or
learn from their mistakes, and then so they're like, oh, I'm protecting you, but actually you're not letting me live and experience it myself.
Exactly. Right, that's how we first learn these stories, as protection, because it originally often comes from teachers and parents and older siblings or whatever, that think that they're protecting you and trying to help you, and we internalize them, and then we are unconsciously carrying them in our life, and we don't know that this protection is happening. So learning to recognize the inner critic stories and being able to say what Karen was like, Oh yeah, I hear you. Like, thanks for I give it the hand, like tell it to the hand, or or I'll be like, you know what? Thanks for sharing. Unsolicited opinion, but okay, thanks for sharing. And then I have to reorient to myself, and this is where the curiosity part is like, I don't know if that's going to be the outcome. I don't know if I'm going to be rejected and thrown from the cave. And I bring curiosity and say, I'm willing to do an experiment. I'm willing to, let me just try this out. And I basically negotiated with the inner critic because I didn't so much have imposter syndrome. I just had a constant inner critic.
But everybody has that initially, the 24, until you start to learn some habits to,
Yeah, I don't think
doesn't everybody have their inner critic? Well, I can say everybody, but initially I think everybody does have an inner critic.
I think we all have an inner voice that's trying to keep us safe.
But it may not be the inner critic that takes you down a path.
Yeah, the critic is particularly harsh. It's harsh. It's very demeaning. It focuses on what it thinks your flaws are, your imperfections, and it predicts an outcome. Oh, she must be mad at me. It must be because you did something. It's problem solving. It's like, oh, let me identify what the cause was that you screwed up so that you can go fix it and not be thrown out of the cave. And so the combination of the problem solving and the safety of the inner critic, it uses shame a lot. Anybody who's experienced shame understands what you maybe haven't called it the inner critic. We have a friend called the shame gremlins.
And you say shame versus guilt. So that's one thing that I learned the difference. So maybe you could help the audience explain it better than I can about shame versus guilt.
It's real simple. Like, guilt is I did something wrong, and shame is I am wrong.
Yes. And imposter syndrome for me it was all shame. I realized it was like all shame.
Yeah, they're very co-occurring because the inner critic is so mean. Mm-hmm. It isn't just that you did something wrong. It's always that you are so unlikable. Like, mine was, you're fundamentally broken and unworthy of love and belonging. That was basically my inner critic. And this is why I'm always going to recommend therapy. It was really working with a wonderful therapist who challenged me. She would bring it to my attention and say, geez, you're so annihilating toward yourself. But I was so familiar with this voice. I didn't even quite understand what she was talking about. It felt right to me. Like, it was just so familiar that I was like, what? For her, I think the seed that she planted in me was to start to be curious about that. Start to challenge my own supposition that it was normal to think this way. It was normal to talk to myself that way. Like, she started to plant the seed of doubt. And when you have that seed of doubt, you have to bring in curiosity. Oh, maybe is there something else? So curiosity and humility are part of dealing with the inner critic. Humility is being able to you not inflate your sense of self, but also not to diminish, which is what the inner critic does. It's to just be in reality with the awareness of there are many things that contribute to where you are.
Yeah. Right. I also was thinking about the inner critic, how it shows up for me when I started to really hear what it was saying. I started to recognize how horrible it was saying that I would never say it to another person. Mm-hmm. In the inner critic, when you know it's the inner critic that you can label as an inner critic, for me was when someone like saying, when you heard what they said, I had to put that check in and realize how devastating it was that I would never say that to another person.
Yeah.
And so that's the whole point about the inner voice is always loving. And even when it says you something, that's the whole point of the guilt. It says, oh, maybe you did something wrong. It's like the maybe instead of you did, right? It's like you should. And so I think that was a way also me to separate a little bit too, was the ability to understand that, treating yourself that same kindness and empathy that you would offer another person, whether a friend or not, but, facing a similar challenge. Like, maybe you have a best friend and they're direct, but you wouldn't say some of the things that your inner critic would say to you. And I think if you had that very strong inner critic, the author of Positive Intelligence, where I do this mental intelligence, was telling me about, he called his the executioner. I'm like, that's perfect. This, but I was not that mean. So I called it the Black Knight, BK, the Black Knight, because the knight means that it was good, but the black was there was so much darkness in it. So it's like the BK. And then someone else calls it CC for, I forgot why she called it CC, but it was interesting how we all have different names for it, which made me like not always call it inner critic. It allowed me to call it something else and say, I hear ya, BK, got it, and then I can move it on. But like you said, it's a therapist, and sometimes coach can do it, and that's why you have to find out if it's the right coach or not too, because I do that with some of my people too.
Yeah. And a resource that we're going to recommend to you that Karen and I have both worked with, there's a book called Soul Without Shame by Byron Brown. And it is using a mindfulness-based approach to deal with the inner critic. And we'll put a link in the description below. And what I like about this book, and I recommend it to any client I have who's dealing with the inner critic, this is like one of their homework is they have to get this book. And I always tell them the first 4 chapters are the first 3 chapters are a little esoteric. So I always tell them they can skim it. Like just skim the first 3 chapters. Each chapter has an exercise, a little vignette and exercise. So skim the chapters, do the exercises. And I think from chapter 4 on, it starts to get a little bit more grounded and relatable. Karen and I actually used to meet for breakfast. We would spend a week, like read the chapter and working on it, and we'd get together. So it's really good to do with somebody. So you could really process, so whether it's with a friend, with a therapist, with a coach, it's much more effective to go through this book and the exercises and develop the mindfulness practice. Because one of the things about the inner critic that we're just going to briefly touch on is it's not that effective to try to fight with the inner critic.
Exactly.
Yeah. If you try to cognitively challenge, so in my field, there's something called a gold standard of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it would recommend that you would challenge it by saying, well, where's the evidence that I'm a loser? Trust me, the inner critic
will always win.
Always
win. It's like it knows where all my hot buttons are, and I'm just like dead in the water. So just being in the present moment is like, oh my God, why did I even try? You're just not going to win.
Yeah. And even if you come up with evidence, it will have some reason to make that evidence not valid.
And it sounds so good. Like it sounds so good. Like it can create that doubt. Like,
And that would be challenging the inner critic. Well, no, I'm not that bad. Oh, it was fine. That's challenging it. Or you don't know what you're talking about. It's also to trying to talk yourself up, which I've seen as some of the strategies in dealing with imposter syndrome is to pump yourself up. That actually runs the risk of triggering sort of a rebound or backlash of the inner critic. It might give you a temporary relief, but you can bet the next time the inner critic comes, it's going to now know how you're pumping yourself up, and it's going to have a way now to deflate that, which is why those strategies are only temporary. So with this book, Byron Brown, he calls either side, pumping yourself up or trying to negate the inner critic, are both engaging the inner critic. And so the goal is to learn to disengage, where you're just like hearing it as this external thing and like, well, that's your opinion. I'm going to do an experiment. And I'm like, oh, thanks for sharing. But you don't engage in trying to challenge it or pump yourself up. You just acknowledge that it's there. It's why the mindfulness practice, where you learn to be aware of your thoughts and just name it thinking instead of getting hooked into the story. You do this practice of bringing your awareness back to your breathing. As the thoughts or criticism comes up, you acknowledge, you say thinking. I actually would say judging, because it was constantly judging. I'm like, it's okay.
I think that's it.
Name it as judging.
Yeah, I think judging is more right.
Yeah, the more I say
inner judge. Yeah, inner judge.
I'm judging all the time. If I say thinking, well, to be honest with you, I like thinking. So it wasn't as impactful for me as naming this process going on as judging, and then reorient back to the present moment. And this is a method that we recommend, and using this book as a way to do some deep work on healing the inner critic, and then bringing that compassion that Karen mentioned about hearing it and just observing, like, wow, I wouldn't talk to a friend this way, because that's how we break free of it, because we're open to being curious. We're open to experiments. Like, Karen, do you have any examples of where, you really did maybe a piece of work really focused on cultivating curiosity with some of the people that you coach?
I've been working with a lot of my coachees, and I'm doing this called positive intelligence, which focuses on the inner judge and all these other saboteurs that helps you bring in more the negative brain mindset. So I do that and I love it because it also has an app along with it. So I love the book that we did. And then for those people who can't do the book and all these other things, there's a lovely app because not everybody can do apps, but I have ability to help have you engage it in learning this via an app, which really helped me a lot too. Curiosity is really, again, is having it's like a childhood curiosity, just trying to understand and not kind of like assuming anything, like even going to a meeting or anything is just knowing what your outcomes are, but don't say, I got to figure it out like you're going to win or lose. Just go in and see how it happened. And I think that's just something. And I told you this, being curious with no expectation. And you said, I can't do no expectations. I use the word no expectations because it's so deliberate. So I have no expectations about something. I go with pure curiosity and it creates a different viewpoint.
Mhm.
Now I say I have an expectation, but I hold my expectation very lightly. In fact, it's an aspiration for me instead of an expectation. And then I can hold it, then curiosity by asking questions and understanding first before I make a decision. So curiosity allows you to understand everything first before you make the decision. And I think our brain moves so quickly that I already go into without curiosity that, that person doesn't like me. Right? Or whatever. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and let me just clarify. And what I just mean by that is it's just the nature of the brain.
Right.
The brain is designed to have experiences, learn from that experiences, and then apply it into the future in order, again, fundamentally to keep you safe or find your mate. I mean, it's just really primitive, where I'm going to have expectation. There's a water hole over there. We can get water so we can walk down there. So there's a purpose why we have expectations. So what I just mean is if we accept that the brain wants to generate expectations and we can bring that awareness and hold them lightly rather than its absolute fact, because expectations is what kills curiosity.
Yes, yes. I love when you make that statement to me before. It's very true. The holding it lightly allows me to take in a lot more information and be curious more. And that's what I love because it really embraces learning in the moment. There's so much that happens in the moment. This makes a lot of sense to me. There's no moment that's exactly like the previous moment. Like this moment now, because there's something different. The lighting, there's like you and I'm in a bad mood right now or whatever. But my whole point of it is never moment will be exactly the same. And so that's the whole point of you can't have that expectation so exactly the same. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I was
No,
thinking about today.
it does. And what's so funny about that is, and the brain hates that. The brain hates that there's this sort of variable of uncertainty. The
Oh
brain,
yeah, because it's trying to find the certainty to make its decision, to make
yeah.
the quote unquote right decision. And I think that's the problem between the right decision versus trusting yourself to know that decision will be exactly what it needs to be or meant to be because you'll processed everything or most of this, all the information.
Yeah, and we've sort of keep touching on this lightly in each of these episodes, but part of the work I think of overcoming and transcending the inner critic is this learning to be in the present moment.
Uh-huh.
And the more so if you understand this, the brain doesn't like that each experience is unique. It wants it to be predictable. It wants it to be the same so that you're going to be safe. So if you understand, the primitive brain wants it to be the same, but everybody has this new brain, the neocortex, the ability to imagine and create and find meaning and think in the future. If we can recognize when the lizard brain is taking over and really go like things like curiosity, meaning, humility, humor, that's all comes from our new brain. So if we can bring more awareness to that, we can start to overcome the primitive aspects that contribute to these strategies.
Yes.
With the imposter syndrome. I'm going to go a little bit right now to more traditional imposter syndrome, or for anybody who's watching right now who is in that category of you're accomplished and you've got these degrees, or you're the CEO or CFO, but you walk into work every day thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be found out. This is where cultivating humility and curiosity, when you choose to always be in the learning mind and you let go of the expectation that you have to be the expert to be safe. Because the high performer, in the background, the safety story is if you aren't always performing at the absolute perfection, then they're going to find out that you're less than perfect and validate all their thoughts that you don't belong.
And then I get fired and become homeless.
Yeah. What a
That's where I go. That's why I knew I had imposter syndrome. Whoa, that's dramatic, right?
Yeah, to have worked so hard to accomplish so much and then not be able to even relax in just appreciation and gratitude of the hard work that you did. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And just to feel that you have to stay ramped up on this, 210% productivity. And people of color, this is something that's particularly in the community of people of color, women, really any minority groups. There are actual, real social norms that are going to be perpetuating these types of safety strategies. I just heard an interview with Michelle Obama recently, and just talking about like the pressure to always be excellent. But at this point in her life, she's able to look back and see the positive that's come out of that. She's able to talk about it. She's able to recognize like, this is kind of crazy to expect ourselves to have to constantly be striving for excellence. But there are bigger benefits that can come out of it. So the idea is like, how can we continue to pursue excellence without annihilating ourselves? There's nothing wrong with pursuing excellence. It's when it starts to become annihilating, when it feels terrifying if you're imperfect, if you don't allow yourself to have the beginner's mind and be able to say, you know what? I don't know the answer to that, but that's a really good question. That's humility. You're starting to, hopefully you guys are seeing how all of these things are sort of connected to each other.
And that's something that you can do it anywhere. You're a contributor or a leader. It's just the fact that you're encouraging learning. No one knows everything. And there's so much more to learn and to grow. And other person's perspective is always going to help you grow and learn because and you have to decide on whether or not that perspective makes sense or not to you. But I love that. I love that example about what you were just saying.
Well, and if we embrace this beginner mind, I think this then goes into our last point today, which is you have to cultivate humor. You have to be able to laugh at yourself, because when you open yourself up to be curious and a learner and beginner's mind, you're going to stumble and make mistakes or have social faux pas. I mean, I'm the queen of social faux pas. I make mistakes all the time. And one of the good things that I really appreciate I got from my family is there's a lot of self-deprecating humor. There's a lot of laughter and being able to laugh at ourselves. And one of the gifts is that the ability to laugh at yourself and see the humor helps your ego to be more flexible. So with imposter syndrome, it's like you're trapped in
trying to be perfect in my mind.
You're trapped in an identity, right? It's like a suit of armor to protect you.
Yeah.
And it's on the armor, all the things that says you'll be accepted. You can't really move, it's not flexible. You're just trapped and it's suffocating. So getting a more flexible ego partly comes at being able to laugh at yourself. Being able to have compassion for yourself when you make a faux pas.
When I can use humor, I say, oh, it's Karen. I didn't say it's Karen. I just say, it's me. So I've been telling my clients about this thing about my Karen Lee-ness. Side user name and then Ness, right? It's just me because no one's perfect. And it's just the part of me that I have to accept. And I started to do that. And then I shrugged my shoulders. I said, oh, that's Karen, or that's Karen-ness, and I started to accept it. That's why for me, a big part of what you just said earlier between the curiosity and stuff is to realize it's about the self-trust, to know the fact. With the curiosity, with the inner critic, and the humility and humor is about you just know that it's within you. You'll make the right decision based on all the information that you have. Yes. And I think it's this whole point of the self-trust part that's really important. So it's not just self-confidence. Like self-confidence, you can pretend you have self-confidence and you have confidence. But I have this trust. That's why my company's called self-trust, because it's so much more deeper in the soul, where I like who I am and I know I can make the best decision I can, so that I don't have to no longer regret the decisions I had before, because I made the decision best that I could at that moment. And that's part of the humor of it too for me, because I start to realize that I am a perfectly imperfect. I say this a lot, guys. So you probably will. This is one of my quotes about perfectly imperfect, and then my Karenness. Because all you got to do is show up for your Karenness and be your Karenness. And be curious and understand what's happening and add to the conversation with your perspective as a gift. Not like letting that gift evaluate you with your inner critic saying, oh, I shouldn't have said that. How many times I used to always say that, I shouldn't have said that. Look at his face. It's like what you're saying earlier. I would like, oh my gosh. And I think, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? I'm not in the right job. And also, and it was just horrible. And this is the whole point about holding it. And then the humor part is just being able to just accept it is what it is. Luckily for me, my job is not a doctor where someone will die for my decision, but 3 things I wanted to say. So, so sorry about that, Christina.
No,
so bring it back in. Wind me back in, Christina.
We're just witnessing Karen's ADHD brain.
I'm so excited.
No, yeah, but I think if you really pull back and listen to what you said, you're really describing life that's the opposite of trying to just maintain a persona and then being afraid of being
like
discovered.
The masking. Yep.
Yeah, that you're an imposter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something that we're going to invite all of you to do is it does require some stopping and really asking some really honest questions of yourself. How much of the way you show up and your own behaviors are you consciously or unconsciously calculating to influence how you're going to be perceived? You want a certain image. So whether it's perfectionism, whether it is the way you dress, the type of interest that you say that you have, whether it is the expectations that you are trying to meet in order to get that external validation that we talked about, the external validation trap, really stop and say, of all these things that I do, how much authentically represents me? Like Karen, the Karenness or the you-ness or the Christina-ness, like how much of that is, it's like, yeah, it's aligned with who I am. If you watch a previous video, we talked about identifying your values because you want to align how the choices you make and how you show up with those values that are internal. And Karen was just describing again, this important aspect of overcoming imposter syndrome is looking inward instead of just outwards. And then, if you mess up externally, because Karen's like, oh, that's me. And with me being on autistic spectrum, I am frequently getting it wrong in terms of social norms because I don't really have the software for most social norms. Anything I haven't taken time to learn, and I'll see the reaction and I'll be like, uh-oh. I'll just say, oops, I think I had an Aspie moment, or I'll just say, yeah, I'm not everyone's cup of tea. Whoopsie, guess that didn't work. And I bring humor to it. I accept that I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I think that's a really big part of letting go of the need to be accepted by every single person that you interact with. And that even includes jobs. When I had done a lot of work on my inner critic, I started changing the way I interviewed. It wasn't so much about trying to sell myself in an interview. It was, this is who I am. Let me find out if this culture is a good fit for who I am.
Yep. Hey, for everybody who's interviewing, that's just as important these days, is finding out it's not about you selling yourself. It's also about you being who you are. Totally agree with you.
Yeah. When I have clients who are in the process of job searching and I see the anxiety, so much anxiety and the worry because they don't entirely know what mask to be wearing. Right? So it's like, don't wear any mask, be professional, focus on your strengths, focus on that you want to be showing up with 80% of your day if you can, and then interview them. What are their values? Does the organization's values line up with yours? When I interviewed to eventually work with Karen, I had such a bad experience at an organization that didn't line up. And I was kind of traumatized by the whole thing. Because again, I didn't know how to mask. So I just didn't fit in every single day. So when I interviewed with the folks at Karen's company, I went, listen, I just need to put it right out there. I am a preventative problem solver. If something doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to want to fix it. I'm not really good at doing things just because that's the way it's done. And if that doesn't work here, we can stop the interview now. Fortunately, I didn't even know, but that was the work of business process reengineering was
exactly what, yeah, that was
exactly
what
the
you're
work.
hired to
I was
do.
just coming out of
Exactly.
me being me, and then pretty much the interview collapsed at that point, and it was like we were just hanging out. But yeah, that was now probably not
Not
considered
be
the
as
norm.
direct, but just to know it or in your mind. Exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
even
I
when
also think for me, I stayed at a job too long, so afraid, but I wish I would have left my company, one of my earlier companies. I stayed there for 23 years. I wish I would have left earlier because being in the imposter syndrome, I was too afraid to leave, that nobody else would want me. Right. That I was just like, and yet, I had Carnegie Mellon, MIT. I had consulting experience with one of the top companies at one time. So it's just, and yet it's just interesting, when I look back, I'm like, wow, like how much my imposter syndrome really stopped me. I mean, I have a good life. I don't regret it now, but I just look back and say, wow, look at that imposter syndrome, how much it stopped me from trying to get out and finding a company that I love and doing things differently. But it was what I needed to do back then when I had imposter syndrome to where I am right now in my journey, where I help others and been on a much better track since I left my company in dealing with it, because I really could focus on dealing with it. So there's a hope when you use some of the information we're telling us and doing the hard work. And that's the whole point. Inner work, it takes a conscious effort to do it, but it's well worth it in the end. And it's not something, it's a journey. There's no quick fix. There's things to cope, but then again, like we always said, then there's these things to try out, like curiosity and stuff. And it's going to feel weird, but if you can start to go with some of the mindsets in the books and stuff that we, suggest and things like that, it goes a long way to just unpeeling another part of it, just trying it and seeing how it feels. With when you're not yourself too, right, Christina? It's like there's a dissonance in you. You'll start to feel it in your body that, oh God, I wish I didn't say that at that interview. Right? As I remember that, like, I wish I didn't say that. Because then it created just a heaviness in what I said. Like, oh my God, there's an expectation. I'm gonna fail because it's not really me, because I knew it's what I should have said if I was there. And that created more stress in my life too. It was unnecessary if I was able to be a little bit about the other way, with not only about sell, but also about figuring out the culture. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to probably go into this more in a following episode on authenticity and yeah, sort of authentic courage or being yourself, because one of the reasons that unconsciously we probably put on that mask and set ourselves up for future imposter syndrome is there's a huge fear that, well, if I'm just myself and I'm rejected, that's way more painful than if I'm like, put in on a role and I got rejected. So, but the problem is you put on the role and you get accepted. And now you're in a situation where you have to, where that you got the job and now the expectation's there. Now you have to perform that expectation. And it literally sets you up for imposter syndrome down the road. If the way that you presented wasn't aligned with what is authentic for you. So even though it's scarier to think about being rejected, being more authentic, it's kind of what Karen said. It's like to avoid over personalizing. It's like, here, this is who you are. And maybe it's a fit and it's not a fit. And you get to decide if they're a fit for you, and they're going to decide if you're a fit for them. And that's just a decision.
I think that's the thing that I remember is I started not trust who I was, and my inner critic already said I wasn't going to get it. And that's why they always say a lot of women don't apply to jobs too, because they don't fit every single thing. And I just say go for it. Like if your gut tells you when you read that you should go for it, have a trusted friend like I had with Christina, says, no, that culture's not right. But anyways, but that's where I was in my life. It depends on where you're at. Like for me, it's more about culture than skills for right now. Earlier on, it's more skills. So that's the whole point is I think it's important that you don't let your self critic say no, 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 unless you don't have the skill. Maybe it's different, but I'm just saying that as well. So, all right, let's go back to, sorry, I got off track with the curiosity, humor. And is there anything else that we would like to say about this?
Well, just to sort of wrap it up was, from the self-trust perspective that you were talking about, cultivating the aspects of humility, curiosity, humor, those are all internal processes. Learning to validate internally, like that is what should take precedence, because you have to learn to appreciate who you are inherently. And it does take courage. It is a journey. It requires courage, self compassion, humor, and sort of a commitment to it really does require this commitment to be brave. You really have to be brave. There's so much fear. It is an innate fear in our lizard brain that if we're rejected, we're gonna die, or you're gonna be homeless. So you have to understand that is coming from our emotional brain. It is coming from our more primitive brain. And we can work to build courage to show up so that we can start off being authentic. So this is prevention. So a lot of what we're talking about is how to deal with imposter syndrome. You already have it, but we also are touching on briefly, you can also work to just prevent even going down the path where you're going to be set up for imposter syndrome. And that's by spending the time to cultivate this internal self-trust and self-love. And that's what we hope for all of you who are watching. And we hope that you continue to tune in to our channel and check out our videos. They are, a little longer than average, but because Karen and I do want to go deep, and we want to continue to invite you to share in the comments, did this resonate for you, to share your stories, what you found worked for you, or what you would like us to talk about in the future, because we are going to be wrapping up this sort of mini segment on imposter syndrome. I think we have maybe one episode that's just focused on imposter syndrome. But after that, we're going to be opening up to much broader topics in the experience of being simply human. And we want to hear what it is that you'd like us to talk about.
Yeah, and some of the topics, just so we can throw it out so people isn't fully on the weird thing. I also thought about talking about boundaries, for example.
You want to talk about trigger
I want to talk about trigger words, right? And I think in expectations, and I think that's the whole point of this is, again, I wanted to remind you that Christina and I, we don't have a full script out. What we realized is the engagement between the two of us to share our experiences, and then ask each other questions and understand is important. And then we also want to hear from you too, like she said. So really, really excited about this, and we look forward to you joining our own journey of our own discovery, because I know when Christina and I talk, we discover new things from each other. So that's exciting too, and we'll discover some new things from your comments and things as well. And hope you'll join us for the next one. Take care, all.
And don't forget to hit like and subscribe.